It's always a good day in the neighborhood when I get to yak with Max Fawcett of the National Observer. Mr. Fawcett, welcome back to the Charles Hattler Show.
Thanks again for having me, Charles. Always a good day to talk.
Max, let me just start with the number one economic story in the land, and it's not a boring, unsexy economic story because it has to do with inflation, and so it ties into affordability, whether we're talking about food or housing, and of course that means interest rates. It would seem to me that interest rates are definitely going to tick down, maybe even a Christmas gift from the Bank of Canada in the lowering of the central rate, because inflation seems to be dropping in terms of how economics goes, dropping like a rock, 3.8% a month ago, and now 3.1%. Your knowledge of economics is a hell of a lot deeper than mine. Would you agree that 0.7, 7/10 of a point in 1 month is a pretty steep drop?
Yeah, it's remarkable. It's as remarkable as the run up we saw in inflation, and I think this was probably always going to be the way it would go. But in the moment, sort of months ago, it certainly didn't feel like this was the path. But there was this intense surge in inflation that was driven by a lot of things that were kind of one-offs, whether it's the war in Ukraine, it's shipping things with COVID, supply chain issues, and those have all, with the exception of the war in Ukraine, kind of been resolving themselves. Even that the spike we saw in energy prices from the Russian invasion has basically disappeared. So this is the system sort of working that crisis through, and I think we're going to see inflation continuing to come down. As the experts predicted, they were much maligned there for a little while in the summer, where people were saying, well, where's your transitory inflation now, economists? But here it is. It's showing up. So I agree. I think interest rates have probably peaked. I think they're going to be on their way down in 2024 and probably further still in 2025. And that, I think, will help explain why it is very unlikely that we will see a federal election anytime before the last possible moment in this government's mandate. I've seen lots of speculation here in Alberta that, there's going to be an election in 2024 because the NDP is going to get sick of the Liberals. Those folks are not doing their basic parliamentary math because the Bloc Québécois actually has more MPs in the House than the NDP does. So there's a lot of ways that the federal Liberals can skin together, a legislative or a confidence motion cat and kind of keep themselves away from an election for as long as they can. And I think there's no guarantees. There's no suggestion that come 2025 they'll look better than they do right now. But it's hard to look much worse. And certainly, if the economy is stronger, if inflation is in the rearview mirror, I think that's going to feel a lot better for a lot more people.
So without getting into the weeds too much on business, the bond market is showing that interest rates are on the decline, and central banks, whether they're Canada, the States, the Brits, the French, the Italians, all central bankers follow the bond market. So interest rates are coming down. It is not wild-eyed at the moment to suggest that interest rates could be down 2 full points between now and the fall. That would mean the fall of 25. That means 2 years from now. It could be even steeper than 2 points, but I'm just throwing this conservative number out there to make this point with you, Max. If interest rates, if the central bank rate is 2 points lower at election time, presuming election time is the fall of 2025, which is the most likely ETA, there's just no way that while Justin Trudeau may have all kinds of issues on all kinds of files, foreign and domestic, there is no way that if interest rates are down 2 points from where they are right now, that he's in the same trouble at the supermarket and at the bank as far as people getting mortgages. There's no way that he's in the same amount of trouble at the bank and the supermarket as he is right now.
No, which is not to say he won't still be in some amount of trouble, because even with inflation coming down, disinflation is not the same as deflation, right? We're not going to see prices start getting cut at the grocery store. We may in certain segments, certain areas, but what this is really about is that prices are going to stop rising as alarmingly as they have been over the last little while. So people, I think, are still going to feel a bit of a pinch, but it's a big difference renewing your mortgage at a central bank rate of 5% versus a central bank rate of 3%. That's that could be thousands of dollars a month for a lot of people, depending on where they're at. So I think it will help their fortunes. They still have to do the work of telling a story about why the voters need to give them another term. And I don't see them anywhere really on that one, with the possible exception of housing, where I think they're starting to build up a bit of a narrative. But they have work to do here. The good news in the inflation story, number one, the good news is everyone's going to be less under the gun on this stuff. That's the good news. But for the government, the good news is it gives them some space to operate. Now the question is, what are they going to do with it? And the one thing I think it's worth pointing out, Carolyn Rogers, who's one of the governors of the Bank of Canada, she was saying that even if rates come down, what they call their neutral rate, which is sort of the rate at which they kind of stop looking to hike or cut, that's probably going to settle out at maybe 3%. Whereas in the past, it's more been in the range of 1 to 1.5%. So, I think we have to get used to the fact that the rates that we've enjoyed since the financial crisis probably are not coming back, and we don't want them to come back in a lot of respects. They were very distorting for the economy. They created asset bubbles in housing and all sorts of other things. So, the ultra low rates, I think, are a thing of the past, but the maybe not ultra high, but the uncomfortably high rates of the present, I think, will also be a thing of the past too.
But the thing is, we have a very low attention span, and when it comes to the calendar, an extremely low attention span. And in 2025, people are likely going to be comparing things to 2022 and 2023, not to 2018 and 2019. It's just the way the human mind works. One of the reasons that some people think that I'm obsessed about this is for this reason. The 18 to 34 demographic used to be very, very good for the Liberal Party in general, and specifically for Justin Trudeau. In the polls right now, it is rotten. But one of the reasons it's rotten is because many people who are between the ages of 18 and 34 think at the moment that they won't be able to afford a home. I don't mean just a bungalow or a two-story. I mean a condo. Won't be able to afford one. I don't think that's the case 2 years from now. But what is your Periscope telling, Max Fawcett?
Lower rates will help. I think prices coming off a little bit will help, but there's prices have risen so much in a lot of major markets that it's still going to be a big lift for young people to be able to get their feet on the property ladder. And I do think, in as much as it's bad economics to create programs or incentives to support younger people buying homes, politically it might be the only thing that saves the Liberal government right now with this demographic. Because, as you say, like, the polling numbers are rotten among 18 to 34-year-olds. I think I saw one poll that had them in 4th place. I saw another one that had them in 3rd place. That is not where they need to be. And a lot of it's just housing. It's that, this is a party that's been in power for a lot of people in this demographic their entire adult lives. And all they see is things getting more difficult. They see the thing that they're trying to grasp onto in the horizon receding further and further away from them. So the frustration is understandable. It's justified. I've heard some folks telling me, well, what do they expect? Do they really think that Poilievre's going to solve their problems? Maybe not, but they're tired of waiting for this government to solve their problems. And you have to be able to sort of feel their frustration. Maybe it's not perfectly rational, but when has politics ever been perfectly rational?
Politics is what gives a lot of people the license to be irrational. I want to ask about the rational, slightly irrational, and at times less than irrational Preston Manning. First of all, he's done a report having to do with COVID. And correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the report that he did seemed to indicate that he feels provincial governments need to respect those people who have all kinds of crazy ideas about how to deal with an epidemic, a pandemic, and a public health issue. And one of the things he seems to recommend, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Max, you're on the ground in Calgary, is this idea that the society in general, but specifically government, has to respect people who honestly don't have a clue as to how to deal with COVID. They simply, I guess, are coming from a good spot, sometimes a religious spot. What is Parson Manning talking about?
I mean, it's the same thing he's been talking about for many months now. It's ironic that the provincial government and the taxpayers of Alberta spent more than $2 million on this report, when he essentially wrote the same thing, I think a year or so ago for a different organization. It was a fictional account, but the same sort of values run through both visions of what should have been done and what was done wrong. I mean, in his view, the great sin of COVID was not that we didn't do enough or that we didn't save enough people. It's that we violated some people's rights. Right. It's that we violated the rights of preachers to do services in person. It's that we took kids out of the schools for too long. And his prescription is essentially that that this Charter of Rights, and specifically Section 1 of the Charter of Rights, which says that we balance some people's rights off against other people's rights, and there are grounds for violating some of our charter rights in exceptional times. He basically says that shouldn't exist, that doesn't exist, and the provincial government should act as though it doesn't exist. And any exceptional measure. So let's imagine we have an outbreak of smallpox in the future. The government could not impose public safety measures before going to the courts and waiting for the courts to rule on whether their emergency powers were indeed constitutional. That would take weeks, months, who knows how long. In the intervening period, many people would surely die. And for him, apparently that's okay. There was a libertarian gentleman here in Alberta who's quite famous on Twitter, or quite notorious on Twitter, who said, death is inevitable. And I feel like that is sort of the underlying truth here. That's what they believe, is that, look, we're all going to die. We might as well, die for having our rights. And it's just a very cold-hearted thing to say to people who saw loved ones, die of COVID, who experienced disruptions in their own life, and who put their own lives on hold because they knew it was in the service of the greater good. And I don't think the idea of a greater good exists for Parson Manning and his sort of view of conservative thought, which is clearly ascendant right now. It is the conservative ideology in 2023, and it worries me because knock on wood, we're not going to get another COVID, but something else bad will happen at some point down the road. And if we are in a situation where there's a provincial government that is guided by these sorts of views and these beliefs, a lot of people are going to suffer unnecessarily in the name of ideology, in the name of libertarian belief. And that's a tragedy that doesn't have to happen. All
right. So now we're being told that, I guess the moment he released the report, this cut and paste job that he got $2 million for. I'm not saying he got $2 million, but it cost $2 million to put this together. He got a few $100,000 out of it. He did very well. That apparently he sent a note to Pierre Poilievre's crew, telling them that this should be front and center in their next election campaign. What specifically, Max Fawcett, does Parson Manning want Pierre Poilievre to be talking about?
Yeah, this is the one that I'm still trying to wrap my head around, because part of me thinks he can't possibly be this stupid to put something like this in writing. Number one, to put it in writing, to say, hey, here's this report that I did with taxpayer money. Please weaponize it accordingly. And then number two, to send it to a Liberal MP, right? So there's two possible options here. Option one is he's kind of, he's losing it. He is not as mentally agile as he used to be. And option two is that he wanted this out there. He wanted this to get released. He wanted this to get circulated, that he was thinking about it in this way. And I still can't entirely figure out why he would want that. But look, I mean, he seems to think that there is a good case for Conservatives to be litigating this in the next election, that they somehow could score points with the public based on the work that he's done and the recommendations he's made and the findings of fault that he saw. That strikes me as a very deep inside the bubble form of analysis. That number one, there are Canadians who want to relitigate this issue in 2025, or that there are Canadians who would, be moved to the conservative side of the tent by the behavior of Conservatives during the pandemic. I mean, honestly, I think that's a goldmine for the Liberals to point out to people that, look, in the heart of a pandemic, Pierre Poilievre didn't believe in government programs. He didn't want to give people money. He wouldn't have done CERB. Your business would have failed. You would have gone personally bankrupt. that seems like a very rich mine for the Liberals or very rich vein for the Liberals to mine. I don't know why Preston Manning is giving them a pickaxe for it. But he seems to think that it's a good idea. And maybe this is just, again, sort of a reflection of his ideological conviction that he has the virtue of truth and purity on his side.
Has Manning actually put it on paper that he doesn't think that programs like CERB should have existed during a pandemic, that the government should do nothing to economically support people who can't be working because of public health issues?
Manning hasn't, but there was that press conference that Poilievre did where he basically said, well, we don't believe in big fat government programs. And what else is CERB if not the biggest, fattest government program probably in Canadian history? So I think there are some very real questions about how they would respond to a crisis should one arise under Poilievre's leadership. And those are questions that deserve to get litigated during an election. Especially in light of the fact that we seem to have a bunch of provinces now who will sit on their hands if there's a public health crisis and sort of stand up for the rights of rural people to believe things that are not true, to provide non-scientific information to experts. There needs to be a safety net, and at this point it kind of has to be the federal government because the provinces and the prairies don't seem very interested in standing up for science.
So our hospital services, ambulance services, firefighting, police, are all of those big fat government programs?
Well, I mean, yeah, they are. I feel like conservatives like to pretend that the only form of government spending is paper pushers in Ottawa who leave work at 3:30 and call in sick 3 days a week. That's a caricature of the civil service, but it's also a caricature of what public spending account is dedicated to. Like you say, it's mostly frontline people. It's doctors, nurses, firefighters, paramedics, people like that. And this is always the question that people should ask when someone says, "Well, I'm going to cut government spending." Where are you going to cut it? Who are you going to cut? And we just saw a president elected in Argentina who basically made that his entire platform, that he's going to slash, I think he'd take a chainsaw to government spending. I think we're going to see some very, very catastrophic outcomes there. And it's worth asking people here, when you talk about wanting to make big cuts, who are you cutting? Because it's not just these sort of nameless civil servants who don't do anything. That's not really a thing that exists.
Is there any evidence that, because I've seen the math and you've seen the math, I didn't see any evidence that Stephen Harper took a chainsaw to federal government spending.
No, funny how that works. Same in Alberta. Under the UCP, government spending has continued to increase because guess what? These sort of free lunches that they seem to think are sitting there waiting for them to eat don't exist. There is not actually that much fat for them to cut. You don't just come into government and go, well, we'll just fire all those people and that's 20% savings right off the top. It's a lot more complicated than that. I wish we can certainly have a conversation about how to make government services more efficient. Lord knows I worked in government for a few years. I've seen some inefficiencies, but it just is not as easy or as cut and dried as folks like to pretend. And that I think is a reflection of the reality of governing, and hopefully that is where our attention turns over the next little while, away from these sorts of manufactured scandals and whatnot, and towards, what are these various parties that are vying for our votes going to do with the power we would give them, right? What changes are they going to make?
Every time Poilievre and his crew talk about spending cuts, and someone says, "So what are you talking about?" They first thing they talk about is the CBC. So
Yeah.
Max, you're the math guy in this conversation. How much of a tax cut would be created if the CBC was burned like toast?
Yeah, if they took a torch to the CBC, so that's over. Let's say they do Radio-Canada as well, which I mean that would never happen, but it's over $1 billion. Let's call it. It's basically a rounding error. So it probably saves people maybe 1/5 of 1% on their income taxes. Maybe it's not even that.
We're talking about less than $1 a week.
We're talking about like a really bad coffee a week.
Right.
And it's always interesting to me how situational the outrage of taxpayers' organizations is on stuff like this. And this is one of my long-standing hobby horses. But we have a situation here in Alberta where the provincial government bought $80 million worth of bogus Tylenol from Turkey. Only a quarter of it has been delivered. Nobody wants it. They've tried to give it away to other provinces. They don't want it. The hospitals don't want it. It's probably going to expire unused. And there are a lot of questions about who arranged that contract, who benefited from that contract, who lobbied for that contract. There are some very interesting allegations that there is someone whose son works for the UCP government who's involved in procuring that contract. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation has been absolutely silent about this issue, as they tend to be about all taxpayer affronts that happen under non-progressive governments. And I just, I wish that if nothing else, the folks that claim that this is their biggest concern were consistent about it being a concern and didn't turn the concern button off when it was politicians wasting taxpayers' money that they support.
So Jim Dinning, who's a formerly credible progressive conservative cabinet minister in Alberta, and is I guess now heading up a crew to advance the cause of the Alberta pension plan, is now saying that he's actually quite happy with the services provided to him by Canada's pension plan. What's up, Max? What's going on?
Yeah, I think he understands that going after the CPP is probably not a winning sort of argument, even in Alberta, where these sorts of arguments tend to play a little better. What it ultimately boils down to, what this whole Alberta pension plan conversation is going to boil down to, is can we get more money out of it, and can we punch the rest of Canada in the face in the process? And there's a lot of people in this province who really want to do that. They really feel like they've been wronged over the last few years, especially by Quebec, especially by people from Quebec and prime ministers from Quebec, that they haven't supported the oil and gas industry, folks in Ontario, folks in Atlantic Canada. And so we're going to take our money out of the Canada pension plan, and you all can figure out how to deal with it because you haven't supported us in our issues. And number one, that relies on math that, I think we've probably discussed, that is fantasy math. There's no universe in which Alberta gets 50% of the Canada pension plan. So that's not going to happen. But, it kind of betrays an un-Canadianness that I find really disconcerting in Alberta. And it's a un-Canadianness that conservative politicians here have been encouraging, amplifying, egging on for a while. And it, as much as I want to dismiss the sort of separatist talk that's always sort of at a low rumble in Alberta as just that, at some point, it's going to build to something more dangerous, I think. And my concern here is that the way this is going to play out is the federal government, because the federal government is ultimately the one that gets to decide on this. Alberta can come up with all the numbers it wants. It's the feds who get to decide what the number really is. And they're going to come up with a number that is much more proportionate to Alberta's contributions and to its population. So something in the neighborhood of 20%. And then you're going to have Danielle Smith and Jim Dinning talk about how unfair it is, how Alberta's getting screwed again, how the federal government doesn't care about Alberta, and it's just going to ramp up the temperature here. It's just going to put the pot on an even hotter boil. And I understand why they think that's politically advantageous for them, but at some point it's going to boil over. It has to, and we don't know who's going to get burned by it.
But Max, I don't understand. My relationship and the relationship of every single Canadian with the Canada Pension Plan has nothing to do with the province they live in. I mean, in my adult life, I've lived in Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, Alberta, and British Columbia. And I now receive a CPP. And I've asked, does any of what my compensation is, my CPP, does any of it have anything to do with where I've lived? And the answer I've gotten from several sources is absolutely not. So what on earth are we talking about?
It's all premised around this very, I think, one-dimensional or two-dimensional reading of the data, which is contributions from Alberta and then retirement benefits collected in Alberta. And that overlooks people like you, thousands of people, millions of people probably over the course of Alberta's history who have come here for work, whether it's from the Maritimes, from BC, from Quebec, wherever, and then left, whether it's 3 years later, 30 years later, to either retire somewhere else or live somewhere else. And so, this notion that we're somehow being wronged because people are able to come here and work and go somewhere else and retire makes no sense at all. It is I think, deliberate misinterpretation of the data, and it's also a willful ignorance or a willful sort of refusal to acknowledge the benefit that labor mobility has had for Alberta. We would not be this prosperous province if it wasn't for the fact that people could come here from Newfoundland and from British Columbia and work in the oil sands or wherever it might be, generate income, make a living, and then go home. Those people pay taxes here. Those people support businesses here that are prosperous here. And that's why the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business have all come out and been very clear in their way, as clear as they can be with a conservative government, because they have to tread pretty carefully. But they've been clear they don't like this idea at all because it threatens the labor mobility that is so important for business, right? If businesses here suddenly have to contend with uncertainty about an Alberta pension plan, maybe that tech worker that they're trying to attract from Toronto or Montreal says, you know what, it's an extra layer of uncertainty. I don't want to have to deal with it. I'm just going to stay here with my job here. And if we can't attract the best and brightest people, that impacts the economy. That is bad for Alberta. And that there hasn't been a better understanding of this, I think, is in part on the official opposition, because they've been talking about how Danielle Smith wants to steal people's pensions, and that's number one, not true, and number two, unhelpful. It's inflammatory. It confuses people. There's a better way to push back against this, but we need people who are coming out in force in public and explaining to people this idea is not bad for pensioners, not bad for Albertans. It's bad for business. That is the core of it. It is bad for the Alberta advantage. And hopefully we get a better and more robust conversation about that in the next little while.
Max, let me say something. And if you want to classify it as, boomer stuff, go ahead. You're an Xer, I'm a boomer, or are you a millennial?
I'm an ex-millennial. I'm right on the cusp.
Okay. All right. So, all right, but classify this as old-fashioned if you like. I've got some documents that are government-related, as everyone does. And when I, look at my driver's license and I look at my health card, I'm a Manitoban. I'm proud to be a Manitoban. But the only document I have that is absolutely sacred to me is my Canadian passport, which relates to my Canadian citizenship. And I've been an Albertan, I've been a British Columbian, I've been a Quebecer, I've been a Manitoban, I've been an Ontarian. But none of that means nearly as much to me as it means for me to be a Canadian. So am I giving you, old-fashioned stuff here? Is it irrelevant to people who are under the age of 40? I mean, you tell me.
I don't think so. Maybe I'm in the same bubble that you are, but I have always been, I've always thought of myself as a Canadian. I've always been proudest of my identity as a Canadian. That didn't change, whether who was in power, if it was conservative or liberal. I genuinely don't care about that stuff. I've always been proud of my country. And one of the things I've been proud about is that I'm able to move around it. If I want to be in BC, I can be in BC. If I want to be in Alberta, I can be there, and be in Ontario, whatever. And I don't have to think about these things. I think there is definitely a cohort of people in Alberta who are, Alberta firsters, who genuinely, have this narrative about being exploited by the rest of the country, and dates back to the founding of the province and blah blah blah, whatever. If you want to be angry and you want to be you feel like a victim, there are lots of politicians who will fill your cup for you. But I still think that you and I are in the majority. I still think that the majority of people in Alberta, and certainly the majority of people outside this province, are proudest to be Canadians, and treasure their Canadian identity above all else. The thing I find interesting about the UCP's push around some of this stuff, they talk about the evils of red tape and wanting to get rid of government regulation, but they are actively going around trying to make life more burdensome, create more regulations, create more red tape for everyone. There's talk about creating basically an Alberta tax authority that collects taxes here the same way it does in Quebec. That would mean a lot of people would have to file 2 separate income tax returns. If there's an Alberta pension plan, that probably means that there's more paperwork associated with that. I mean, it's great news for HR companies in Alberta. I don't know, maybe HR companies are big donors to the UCP, but in terms of getting rid of red tape, they are the biggest creators of red tape I've ever seen in my life. And again, it's very odd that doesn't get called out by folks who are otherwise so invested in cutting red tape.
Why do you want to get rid of Rachel Notley?
I don't want to get rid of her. I think she's performed a wonderful service for Alberta. She was a great premier. She was a good opposition leader, but every politician has their moment, has their time. She's been leader for 10 years now. It's been a good 10 years, but I think the moment has moved past her leadership. I think the last election here in Alberta back in May was very winnable, and they didn't do the things they needed to do to win it. So I think that a new leader of the party, one that is more in touch with the things that are happening here in Calgary, the things that are happening outside of Edmonton, would help the party grow its appeal to the extent that it needs to win the next election here in 2027. I just don't believe that another election with her at the helm is one that the NDP is going to win. She's, as I said, she's fantastic, but she is as Edmonton as they come. She is from the most progressive orange riding in the most downtown part of Edmonton. And I just think that the NDP, if they're going to make the gains in Calgary and Lethbridge and Red Deer that they need a leader who's not from that part of the province.
Okay, just one more thing, Max Fawcett of the National Observer. I get why partisans would keep yammering. Conservative partisans would keep yammering about how Trudeau's got to take a walk in the snow. I mean, that's dropped it easy. But why do professional observers who are not partisan conservatives, where's the evidence for them that if the Liberals change leadership, that would be a magic ticket to power? This is very much a Justin Trudeau party, much more than it is a Liberal party. So where are people coming from when they seem to be saying that if Justin Trudeau leaves and he's replaced, the Liberals will just shoot up like rockets?
I mean, I think part of that is just the nature of the job that we do as pundits. You have to stir the pot from time to time, and it's sort of like, like people with their fantasy sports teams. They like to imagine, well, what if I traded this person for this person? Oh, that'd be a good fantasy trade. You only see the good in your sort of fantasy imaginations. There's a phenomenon in the United States where they'll poll the popularity of the Donald Trump, Joe Biden, and then they'll poll what they call a generic ballot. So it's like a generic Democrat. Put your favorite person in there that you imagine. The generic ballot always does better because the generic ballot does not have any negatives attached to it. They don't have an opposition campaign. They don't have people criticizing the generic ballot. And I think there's a generic ballot phenomenon here as well. Would the Liberal leader of everyone's personal preference be better than Justin Trudeau? Sure, absolutely. But that's 12 different people, and it doesn't work that way. And so when it comes down to actually zeroing in on one person, everyone on the list of potential candidates has some pretty major drawbacks. I'm a fan of Mark Carney. I think Mark Carney would bring a level of seriousness to politics that we really, really need right now. He's also not from Quebec, and the Liberal Party without a leader in Quebec tends to do pretty badly. And that's where the base of their support is right now. So that would be a bad idea. Chrystia Freeland, same problem. Melanie Joly, not sure she has the heft or the gravitas to get the job done. And on down the line you go. There's always a reason why whoever might succeed him would or could do worse. And that is sort of the conundrum that they face is there's no clear option that would obviously do better. And I will say this is dredging up some old grievances of mine, but I can't help myself. Even when there does appear to be a clear option, and I'm thinking back to Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien, where the Martin people said, Martin's going to win 200 seats and Chrétien's not popular anymore. Martin didn't end up winning a majority. Even when there was a clear alternative, it turns out it wasn't that clear and it wasn't much of an alternative. So, part of me thinks that the way that our political system works, they won with Trudeau, they're going to have to lose with Trudeau one way or the other.
Well, you talk about Paul Martin, and a lot of people thought that Paul Martin would, be prime minister for life, and he'd be so much better than Chrétien. But the truth is, Paul Martin didn't do as well as Chrétien. And to dig the sword in a little bit deeper, Stéphane Dion didn't do as well as Paul Martin. And I hate to add insult to injury, but Michael Ignatieff didn't do as well as Stéphane Dion. So it just seems to me that, between the several prime ministers who followed Chrétien were duds. Sorry, Paul. Sorry, Stéphane. Sorry, Michael. But Justin Trudeau was the first winner after a fairly long drought by Liberal standards.
Absolutely. And everyone who is elected today, in some respect, owes their election to his charisma, his personal popularity, and his political talents. And so you're not going to get the sort of uprising that you saw with Paul Martin, where you had these grumbling, sort of discontented backbenchers fomenting a leadership challenge. The party doesn't even work like that anymore. You don't have that mechanism the way they did to take over riding associations and eventually call for a leadership race. So, Justin Trudeau will be done when he decides to be done. And my sense is that he is not a quitter. And my sense is that he, at the very least, wants to, if he can't beat Poilievre, he wants to beat him up a little bit.
That's very true. There's one guy I know that he doesn't impress you as much as he impresses me, but there is one Liberal in the ecosystem that I really think has strong political legs, and that's Sean Fraser out of Nova Scotia, the current housing minister.
No, I agree. He is a rising star in that party. He has taken the portfolio that I think has been death for a lot of people, and honestly, that I thought was going to be death for him in some respects, and he's made it into life, and it's been very impressive. So, I'm a little nervous or a little skeptical that an MP from Atlantic Canada can be a national leader, but maybe that's just my British Columbia bias showing or something. I kind of want to see someone from BC be the next leader, but he is definitely talented, and they need more people like that. That is the big issue, is that there have been so few stars in the party other than Trudeau and perhaps Freeland, that when it comes to any sort of inevitable succession, they don't have a big field to draw from. Certainly not as big as it could be.
Well, since you mentioned BC, and I don't have as much BC years as you do, but I've got enough to tell you this, Max Fawcett, and on this I think we'll be on the same page. If the National NDP at some point makes a change, and there's a good chance that would happen after the next federal election, that's the way that party tends to trend. David Eby, I think, might be the first leader. If David Eby becomes a national NDP leader, current premier in British Columbia, I think if David Eby becomes the national federal NDP leader, he will be a superstar. It's just not fair to compare one person to another, but I'd say he'd be the first NDP superstar since Jack Layton. What are your thoughts about that?
You've clearly been reading my work, because I had a whole column about how impressed I was with David Eby. I first encountered him back in. I knew about him, but I first sort of started talking to him when I was in my role as the editor of Vancouver Magazine, and we had a good chat about housing, and the way that he talked about it back then, and this was 2016. He got it in a way that no one else that was elected at that point got it. And that hasn't changed in his time in government. I mean, he took on the Trial Lawyers Association of BC on auto insurance. He took on the Downtown East Side. Like, he takes on these big files that should be a political graveyard, and he just walks right through them like it's nothing. So I think he has incredible talent. He's smart. He also has this sort of nerdy dad energy that is just endlessly endearing. It makes him really hard to attack. I agree. I think he would be an amazing national leader. I'm not sure that the federal NDP wants someone like him at this point. That would be my concern. Is I think there's a lot of resentment among New Democrats federally at their BC peers, because they win elections and they talk to the business community, and they're not shutting down the fossil fuel industry. And I think there's a lot of people that would want someone much more radical than David Eby. And I had, in response to that article I wrote about him, I had someone reach out to me and say, "Hey, why doesn't he lead the federal Liberals?" And I thought, it works for me. I think the federal Liberals would be incredibly smart to try to poach him, to bring him in and involve him in their leadership conversations. Either way, I think, no pun intended, given how tall he is, he's gonna cast a long shadow in politics for some time to come.
It's interesting. When I was just an Eastern bastard a long time ago, I used to think that the NDP was never really about government. It was just a cause, and that was because in growing up in Quebec, that's how I viewed the National NDP. But of course, I got to Western Canada, to Manitoba and British Columbia specifically, where I saw, oh my goodness, the NDP in these places is actually serious about forming government. I never got to live in Saskatchewan, but of course I would have said the same thing. So if you're based in Western Canada, as you are, Max Fawcett, and a lot of time in BC, it's easy to see the NDP as something that's beyond just a cause.
100%. And look, if it's not Eby, it might be Wab Kinew. He has the same sort of portfolio of talents. He's smart. He's personable. He's always smiling. He's always, he's funny. He's got the dad jokes, and he knows how to win elections. And again, you want to talk about an interesting value proposition for the federal NDP. Having someone who could be our first Indigenous prime minister, I think would scratch a lot of people where they itch. And to be able to combine that with his sort of pragmatism, his economic savvy. He started off that campaign, as in Manitoba, by basically saying, "I'm going to cut your taxes," and he took that whole tax issue off the table. Every NDP leader should be using that as a template for future election campaigns, of how to kind of deal with the negative associated with their brand, so they can talk about the positive.
Well, he's a great TV. He's great on video. He knows how to do digital campaigns, and that's something that he has a lot in common with David Eby and, frankly, with Justin Trudeau. And I would say that anybody today who aspires to leadership who can't do TV should go do something else. Max Fawcett, thank you for doing what you're doing. And about the business of Eby, and maybe I snagged it from you. It's entirely possible. I read all your columns in the National Observer. And thought bubble formed in my head a little while ago, and you probably planted the bubble, so let me give credit where credit's due.
We're on the same page. I love it.
Max Fawcett, National Observer, and he's based in Calgary. My name is Charles Adler. Thank you for watching and listening to the Charles Adler Show podcast. Bye-bye for now.